welcome to another Football Studies episode. I am your host, Felipe Tobar, Assistant Professor here at Clemson University. And today is another special episode. We are hosting Alexander Jacskon, a curator of the National Football Museum in Manchester, England. He was awarded the 2023 Lord Aberdare Literary Prize by the British Society for Sports History for his book, Football's Great War, Association Football in the English Home Front, that we're going to be talking about in today's episode. In partnership with Football War Network, in the person of Alexandrou, that is also joining us today, we're hosting this very, very special episode. So I would say the official welcome to Alexander Jacskon. Thanks for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting us to be on this.
Amazing, Alex. The same for you as always. Thanks for being with us.
A pleasure as always, and I'm really looking forward to this afternoon's conversation.
Yes, afternoon in the UK, early morning in the US. And we will have, of course, audience from all other parts of the world that are interested in this relationship between football and war. So, Alexander, the first question is, how started your relationship with football?
I'm trying to think now. I've been like quite a lot of people interested in football as a kid. My dad kind of got me into it. He was a big Newcastle United fan, and trying to think back that, yeah. And so started off playing football, and when I was growing up, I had actually just behind me. One second, sorry. Just realised this. When I was growing up, my dad was also very keen on football, on history and literature, and like that kind of stuff. And so he had a series of sort of, I don't know how well you can see it, sort of, these were sort of popular histories written like in the 60s and the 70s as a kind of magazine format, an almost updated version of the 1905 Book of Football, which is one of the early attempts to like historicise the game, sort of about 30 odd years into sort of, well, I say not 30 odd years, sort of about 40 years since the Football Association had been founded. And so I grew up with these kind of ones as a kid, and that's how I got started on sort of interested in football history, because it had bits about famous matches, famous players, how to play the game. And then when I went off to university, studied history. And then after that, I was sort of like, was trying to find a career where I could combine my love of history as a sort of as a profession. And I sort of looked at museum work, and I was very fortunate that I did a master's. And then at the time I was doing that, an opportunity came up to work with the National Football Museum. So I got to start then turning my passion for football into something I actually studied academically. And then that, very fortunately, that was a collaborative PhD with the National Football Museum. And when it came to the end in 2011-12, the museum was moving from its first site in Preston to Manchester. So then I was hired as a museum curator then, and I've been with the museum ever since. So I think that's sort of two questions in one really there, how I went from like being interested in football into my career, so to speak.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm remembering. I think I saw you, Alexander, when I visited the National Football Museum in 2018. When I went to a Manchester United Young Boys Champions League match, and I think on Wednesday.
Excellent.
Very cold night, and I visited the museum just before the match. And of course, you also have been in other football collective conference, so I think we share the same space. So tell us a little bit more about the motivations behind writing this very important book about football and war.
Yeah. So not too long after I'd been working at the museum in 2013, we started thinking about whether we wanted to do any particular work around the football and the First World War as we were moving up to the centenary in 2014. And it was very interesting because initially we were thinking like, perhaps this wouldn't something we go for, perhaps we wouldn't have very much in the collections. And then we did a little bit of a review and analysis of what we had. We found that we had probably a bit more. We also thought about and thought we actually will have more that's not, say, tagged or highlighted as being directly from the war itself, but to do with people who were in it. And then the museum made a decision to apply for funding, because in the UK, like in many places, you do lots of certain projects by getting external funding, and one of the big ones is the Heritage Lottery Fund. So we applied for a significant body of money there, and that gave us then the backing to do a large scale exhibition that was on through most of 2014. And so that was really interesting. So you're doing the research for an exhibition, and curators often will pick up a topic, you'll do it for a period and then move on to the next one. And then what for me was quite interesting was that I'd studied warfare and military history at university. So I had a bit of an interest in that particular side of history. And then with the football, it was kind of bringing the two together. And what we found was that in terms of what had been done already in the literature by other historians, whether independent or academics, was there was more of a focus on, say, the front lines, like footballers serving in the front lines, those kind of stories, club histories looking at the players who'd gone and served. And then there was this kind of more of a gap really around the home front. There was some writing about women's football, because obviously it's a very key period and already been established as a key period. But then what I kind of found was that there was actually no one single sort of narrative history or longer history of the home front as a whole, and especially men's football. And then when you got into it, it was very fascinating because a lot of people, whether historians or other sort of journalists, often assume that men's football stopped in 1915 when you have the FA banning professionalism, but that's not the same as stopping football. What they did was they banned the payment of players specifically, and just players. And so what I found then was pulling together all of that sort of from the exhibition was that, oh, there's a bit of a gap here. It's something I'm a bit mad, perhaps I'll explore in my spare time. So through the rest of 2014 up to for about another 7 or so years, I was researching it in my spare time, using the collections at the museum, but then also going to like the British Library, to local studies libraries, other places that had material. So I was chipping away at it sort of like evenings and weekends and holidays. And sort of as I kept going, it was like, oh, there's tons here, there's masses, it's amazing. Like I can't see actually how someone perhaps hasn't picked it out in this way before. So I was quite lucky in the sense that I felt very much that I was finding new original material all the time. And then in the end, the challenge became like condensing it down, like what to focus on. But yeah, after about 8 years or so, I managed to finally sort of finish it off and get it out there. So, and it was very nice because Pen and Sword, my publisher, obviously I should give a big shout out to. They're a commercial publisher who do a lot of local history, military history, and so it was really lovely to be able to get the interest and backing of a commercial publisher as opposed to an academic publisher, just because hopefully it will mean that I'll have reached a bit more of a broader audience with the book being out in that format and out in shops and at an accessible price, because obviously a lot of academic publishing can sometimes be quite expensive and quite hard for people who are interested in it to access.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I imagine everyone that reads the book will have an accessible language, will be able to understand the history. Can you summarize a little bit the book structure? What readers will find when they buy it?
It was an interesting one. I spent quite a bit of time trying to work out how I was going to structure it as an approach. And what I ended up doing was sort of it proceeds chronologically, roughly speaking, but also thematically. So it's beginning and end has like an introduction to British football on the eve of the First World War, and then also summarize what football was like in the interwar period to kind of show where football had come from and gone to. And that long-term impact of the war as well. But the core of the book, it starts off and proceeds chronologically through with sort of key topics as they emerge as being quite important at that time. So some chapters will go backwards and forwards within the war, but they will try and focus on a particular moment and then expand out from it. So at the beginning, obviously, kind of starts off with like the war starting, and then how football response to that, should it continue or not, and then continues through the sort of the 14-15 season, looking at how there were debates about military recruitment, the impact of the war on football initially in terms of crowd, spectatorship. And then I'd almost say then the other core chunk of the book is then taking you through what I would almost call the really forgotten wartime seasons. Because 1914-15 is the one that is most discussed and remembered because of the big criticism of professional football in particular by people who are unsympathetic or found it morally offensive in wartime. But then in the summer of 1915 is often where the story stops for a lot of people, and it's often portrayed as like men stopped playing, women filled the gap, and women's football was popular. Then the men came back and started playing after the war. And what I found was that whilst the professional footballers were forbidden from being paid, lots of the major professional clubs still kept on going, and they formed regional leagues, which were still quite popular, had up to over 1 million spectators a season, which whilst a big reduction was still quite a big crowd number overall. And then it continued over these wartime seasons, being affected in different ways by different things, whether it be conscription, like the requisition of grounds by the government for food production. And so it tried to explore all these sort of different aspects of wartime football. Yeah.
That's really, really interesting. Alexandrou, I know that you have the book with you.
I have indeed, yes.
So can you share your thoughts about the book? What most impressed you in Alexander's work, and some of the kind of comment on some of the thoughts that he just shared.
Well, one of the excellent aspects of the book is, as Alexander said, its thematic nature, and it covers a lot of ground, but in a way that is understandable to everybody. So it is accessible. I think the language is accessible, and what's really good is the number of quotes that Alexander actually utilizes. So you get a real feel of how people thought at the time, be it journalists, be it administrators, be it players, or any other individual that was interested in the game. So, and also you've got the images and the cartoons, and the use of cartoons works really well because they really do convey a significant message. And I think Alexander will back me up on this. The use of cartoons during the First World War, be it for football or for war, were very important in getting key messages across. And one thing that I particularly liked about Alexander's book is the political aspect, particularly in terms of the early conscription or the early volunteering, where footballers were castigated allegedly for not signing up. And this is, and Alexander brings out a key point here, in that, you know, there is a lot of myth surrounding this. The reality was very different in terms of professional footballers either signing up or volunteering of their own accord very early on, and continuing to do so throughout the war. And one of the key aspects of the book is the myth busting that Alexander ensures is the case. And again, the other myth, and I'll come back to the point about the position footballers found themselves in, because Alexander makes some excellent points around this. But the other aspect is that football continued after 1915. It was regionalized, but it was also regionalized in the Second World War as well. But the men's football continued, and that was very important for the populace. It keeps morale up. If there are games to go and watch, when the war continues, everybody said, oh, the war will be over by Christmas of 1914. Well, it was almost Christmas 1918 before it was over. And what you see in Alexander's book is how important football was to different parts of society from different perspectives. Coming back to the footballers themselves, Alexander makes a really good point about how they were treated and basically felt about by the football clubs and the football authorities themselves. In effect, footballers were owned by football clubs. You know, their contracts and so on were very harsh. And it was very difficult, if nigh on impossible, for a footballer that time to try and get out of their contract. And what footballers faced at the outbreak of the war, as well as football clubs and the football administrators, is that the 1914-15 season had already started, just in the September of 1914, prior to war breaking out. But the players were under contract, and they were under contract to play. So they couldn't just stop. It was easier for amateur footballers to stop playing and sign up. And there are examples, and Alexander highlights this in his book, of many amateur players en masse, you know, teams at a time, you know, signing up and joining the armed forces. But much more difficult for professional footballers because they were under contract. And it's these nuances and these myths that Alexander examines and develops. And as I've said before, he busts the myths at times. And I think that is very important. There isn't a book like this out on the market that covers football on the home front in England to this degree, in any shape or form. And I think that is the beauty of this book from my perspective.
That's fascinating. Alexander, can you share maybe the most impactful myth that you debunked? That was like.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, like hopefully if like anyone takes anything away from the book and hopefully stimulates the interest, is that it is just the idea that sort of wartime football didn't happen really, especially between 1915 and 18 specifically. And I think hopefully what I've tried to do is just show that it did continue, the scale of it, not only just the scale of it, but the richness of what was happening, the way it's impacted by the war, but also sort of it impacts on the war itself in terms of, you know, potentially like supporting people's morale, but then also hopefully just across it all, showing the meaning that it had both to people in terms of spectators, what it meant to. So I particularly found it poignant looking at the chapter around the press and how the sports press tried to encourage its readers to send copies to the men at the front, whether it be, in the armed forces, so men on not just on the Western Front, but in Africa, across the global nature of the war, to sailors at sea, and the connections you can see to them, because it's often discussed in the wider literature about war, about what's the meaning of like the home, the nation, what are you fighting for? And this, you can particularly get the sense of for men that, you know, what is the nation, what is it you're fighting for? And it's not perhaps necessarily just the big abstracts of like democracy, empire, things like that. It's also home. And for working class men, often from the big urban areas, it's, you know, urban areas, it's streets, it's towns, it's cities. And that is in some ways most artfully manifested in the football club. It's literally that representation. And obviously historians have spent quite a lot of time discussing the meaning of local identity, how that's manifested both historically and now, what clubs mean. And there it's amazing when you can see like Manchester City fans like writing back home to the Manchester papers and saying, you know, sort of like one of the officers saying like, oh, they lost it's been a lot of tension amongst the men at Gallipoli because like one of the ships got sunk and it had their mail, so they don't know what's happening to Manchester City's title race in 1914-15 as they're sort of competing for it. And so you got men out there in the territorials in Gallipoli fighting the Turks, And for some of them, that connection to home is like, oh, how much is City getting on? Because apparently, like, City always struggled at Christmas time, so they were worried about what kind of results would come through in the press. And so these things can obviously seem quite small and trivial, but actually it's these things that actually can mean, for some people, not everyone obviously, means so much. So that's like just one example of, I suppose, of it. But what was I going to say? I think just also seeing what it meant to civilians as well, that importance of your club continuing to have something to go and do, to see, to support, and to see your players that you supported before the war potentially come back from the front lines where they're fighting. Again, you see lovely little bits when crowds respond. They know someone's come back, they're on leave for, say, 48 hours, and it's like, you know, it's a famous centre forward, they come back, and to see them there on the pitch, there's that connection. Because again, that's something that's come up in the literature, is that it's not this big chasm divide between civilians and soldiers that people have sometimes often assumed, and a lot of historians have done a lot of work in the last 20, 30 years around that. And this particularly, I think, brings it forward that there's this constant conversation going on between civilians and soldiers about what's happening at home, what's happening at the front. And the football clubs and the grounds can be a site for that, or the newspapers, whether it's just for 90 minutes of the week on a Saturday, or throughout the week. So yeah, so it was really, I think, and as Alex has very kindly said, like, the voices, because I was very lucky in finding those through the newspapers, very lucky in finding certain types of accounts and sports writers. Hopefully people will get that feeling for it, that sort of real connection of understanding what it was for, like, people, and how uncertain it was as well. I think we've all now lived through a global crisis in the COVID pandemic, and I think that gives people a sense of how challenging it is not knowing the future. Sometimes it can, when you haven't got a crisis on that ways, things can feel more comfortable. When you are going from day to day, you don't really know what the long, medium and long short term hold. You get a real sense, I think, more for like what they were going through at the time, in terms of, will the war end? You know, will the next offensive be successful? And within that, what will football be like? There's a lot of people trying to imagine what it will be like during the war and struggling with that. And I think hopefully that's something, again, I've tried to convey as well.
I'd like to pick up on that, if it's okay, Felipe.
Sure. Go ahead.
There's two red threads that through the book. I'm not trying to embarrass Alexander here, but I think it is important. The first one, and Alexander just mentioned the word connection. Throughout the book, you see the connections between local communities, their players and their teams, and what's happening on the front lines as well. It's so football continuing in whatever format, be it regionalized men's competitions, women's football, and we'll come on to the women's football aspect of it because Alexander's written quite a bit beyond the book as well on that, which I think is fascinating. So we get it keeps people connected, and by keeping people connected, it enhances the morale of not only those on the front line, but those on the home front, those still at home, whether it's supporters, or whether it's the players, or whether it's the club. You need that, because particularly during the early part of the 20th century, football clubs were at the epicenter of communities at times. Mm-hmm. And I think that is an important element. And they were integral to their local communities. And by continuing to play football in whatever form, it allowed the populace to have a sense of realism and ensuring that they had something to look forward to, because they didn't know how their loved ones were faring abroad. They weren't sure whether they were dead or alive at times. And this is very important to understand, that football was able to, in one sense, it's an early form of well-being. They wouldn't have used the words back then, but for the well-being of local communities, football continuing was important. And again, and I think particularly when it comes to women's football, and Alexander may want to talk a little bit more about this, but women's football was significant from a number of social perspectives, political perspectives, but also the important role women's football played in raising money. In today's money, they would have raised tens of millions, if not more, of pounds for wartime charities. And again, that enhanced the morale of the populace, because they knew they were attending women's football matches, but they knew their money was being used to help wartime charities look after and treat those who had been injured on the front lines as well. And also you see a change in the status of women. Not only have they moved into, maybe on a temporary nature, into men's jobs, particularly in munitions factories and engineering factories, for example, as well as on the land, but they're also playing football, and they're playing to big crowds. And again, that maybe, I would argue, enhanced the morale of women, seeing that they could be treated in a far more equal manner at times within that constricted society of times.
That's really interesting. I will have a question later about whether or not it's a myth of that football had a risk to disappear. I think we kind of get the understanding now, but just a curiosity, Alexander, because I have researched the Spanish Civil War, and I have seen sports battalions being created, and the parties running the Republicans in Spain intentionally asking footballers from Real Madrid and Barcelona to join the lines to inspire this the regular population, right? The normal people to also be there and fight for the cause. Does that also happen in the First World War? They have intentionally used footballers for recruitment purpose. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, so obviously one of the most famous examples within the British context is the Footballers Battalion, which is one that's specifically formed or encouraged for footballers to join, but not just footballers, other people at clubs and also the fans to join up alongside them. And that's very interesting because it does come out of the anti-football criticism, or anti-football campaign rather, of the 14-15 season. Because as we've probably just briefly mentioned before, but the season starts, professional football is not a relatively old thing. It's started in the 1880s. It's part of the modern entertainment industry that includes music halls, theatres, the cinemas beginning to develop at this point, and the drinks trade. And all of these together form part of modern sort of Western sort of like popular culture, but they're also not always popular amongst everyone, particularly amongst probably say sort of centre to right wing sort of political leanings, particularly those particularly invested in sort of military service, whether we're talking in Britain or more broadly across Europe. And so these are seen as threats to the ability to recruit people, for people to do military service, to live up to the patriotic ideal of that sort of militarized pre-war society. And this is particularly pertinent in Britain because, unlike most of the other combatant nations, it relies on voluntary enlistment. Traditionally, the Royal Navy has been the premier service of Great Britain, and Britain's relied on a small volunteer professional army to police and fight its wars and empire. So it's faced with this big sort of, it knows it needs to have a big conscript army. They call for millions of volunteers. At the same time, they're relying on essentially this, to a degree, this kind of same old recruitment processes of the last 200-300 years. They need to encourage people to join up, and part of that is persuasion, part of that is coming, perhaps shaming people into service, and other parts is trying to offer financial incentives. And they quite early on realised they're not offering enough money to recruit, especially men from middle class backgrounds. And that's very, very particularly interesting because that's where the Footballers Battalion comes out, is wider concerns about whether football is holding back men from joining up. Also, it's seen, footballers are seen as very fit individuals who should naturally be joining up. In the eyes of many, they're the ideal recruits. The reality with a lot of these things, and this is known at the time I was trying to explore a bit more, is that it's very much more complicated picture. Often things are very, really simple. So the Footballers Battalion it does get recruits mainly from the south of England, but not so much the north, because those men are joining other regiments, but also quite a number of male professional footballers. They are married. At the time, married men were told, well, we want unmarried men to come first, and married men can come afterwards, in essence. And so many professional footballers were married. They had small children, so they felt unfairly picked on, and they talk about it quite eloquently at the time of like, why am I being picked on and being asked when other people aren't going, or, you know, I've got children to care for. And you have this big challenge where in society where it says the man is the head of the household, he's got to look after his family. He's the one who's got to provide the money. It's a big conflict of like, well, who looks after my children if I leave? Have I got friends or family? Will they able to do it? And so that is quite fascinating. You see that. And on the flip side, as Alex has talked about, you have the amateur players joining up who have potentially less things holding them back, although they have their own jobs. But you also see recruitment posters aimed at them as well, like join the sportsmen's battalions, join up your friends, we want footballers. And the local press does a lot to encourage that in terms of printing news and results of like lists of like how many men have joined up from different clubs and leagues, which when you look at the amateur level, it's quite fascinating. I live in Sheffield. The Sheffield Green and the local sports paper published some really interesting material over several months where it literally named as many players as possible from individual clubs in individual leagues. So you can literally compile a list of about, I think there was about, by the end, about 500 named players. And you can see how many joined up from individual clubs, which regiments. Sometimes you can see they're joining the same regiment, so you kind of wonder, are they joining up as like friendship groups of like, say, 4 or 5 different guys? It was very interesting because like one was a church group, or rather, sorry, one was a church-related team, and they all joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. So you do wonder like whether there's a group of them there who are combining their footballing loyalties, but also their religious loyalties, that they're trying to join a non-combatant unit. They want to serve, but also serve in a way that possibly, like, you know, is in keeping with their religious views. And so it's amazing when you get into that, because it's just the way that sport is co-opted or co-opts itself into that process alongside, like, you know, churches, workplaces. It's fascinating because sometimes they're very clear, the links, and sometimes they're quite we have to read a lot into it. But you just get this feeling of how it sort of intermeshes, and how it's very part of that process that successfully raises a large number of volunteers in 1914 and 15.
I'd like to pick up on a point that Alexander made. I think, well, I know from his book, the manner in which Alexander examined the role of the media at the time, particularly newspapers and magazines, that I think is a fascinating study within the book. And it's not being looked at as Alexander has looked at it. And he manages to bring out the real hostility towards footballers from certain parts of the media that had a political agenda, and that makes for fascinating reading. But it is covered in Alexander's book in a way that it hasn't been covered in other publications. And again, you can see similarities with what's happening now at times with how the media acted back in the early part of the 20th century during this conflict.
Yeah. And maybe, I don't know what's going to happen in the near future, if we're gonna be talking about a new Third World War, or how football is gonna be co-opted or explored. the media. We have been talking a lot about myths that your book kind of talks about. From my understanding, this idea of football disappearing in the war times is another myth, or not, or was
Yeah.
what there was a real risk of disappearance. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's one of those ones. I think it became because professional. It's the idea partly linked into, I think, sort of in sort of peacetime and since then of we tend to think of competitive football as being the important bit. If you look at club history records, you know, it'll be like these are the peacetime seasons. Wartime seasons are then seen, because they had these regional leagues, as sort of alongside friendly football matches that clubs play, as not as important, you know, minor. Uh, and then that sort of over time has and because professionalism stopped in 1915, it's kind of translated into become a shorthand or a misunderstanding of what happened, because there's a less sort of detailed look at it. And so people, and some clubs also stopped playing, which I will talk about in a second. And so that became, over time, became, I think, a kind of easy shorthand. Obviously, things get out in sort of journalistic newspaper articles. Some things can start getting recycling after a while. They kind of, that becomes like the sort of the commonly understood idea. And so what I enjoyed doing was getting into the real detail of that. Well, like, and what you have in the summer of 1915 is that the 14-15 season's come to an end. Crowds have become have dropped off a lot because a lot of men aren't joining up. The sort of rough age group of typically of most sort of fans pre-First World War was something where between sort of like 18 to about like late 40s, so to speak, in terms of how it fitted demographically. And they are pretty much like, you know, basically the crowd was the kind of target that recruiters wanted to bring into the army. So a lot of men are joining up, or others are staying away because of the social pressure on not going. And so at the end of the season, a lot of clubs have made big financial losses. So football, if it's to continue, can't continue in the same way that it's going forward, because clearly it's financially, in its existing model with its existing wages and existing costs, it's not getting the crowds to continue going professional to continue. But also at the same time, professional football, whilst being that big thing that attracts so much interest, it's not the only thing. There's obviously the amateur game as well. So in the summer, you have the FA and also the FAs in different home nations, and also their individual leagues, particularly in Scotland and England, which are the major professional leagues essentially in the world, who represent those clubs' interests, not necessarily the whole interest of the game as it is today. Obviously, English Premier League does not represent football across all of England. And so the football, the leagues are trying to get their head around what we were going to do, how do we proceed. They try to sort of assess, and obviously different clubs and different people who run them have different views, because obviously they're not one big monolithic block. And that's very much about what views people have on the war and the place of sport in the war. And so it sounds quite, might sound a bit boring to some people. I found it really interesting. I got some of the bits that I'd almost love to see dramatized and recreated are the scenes of these meetings in the summer where people are coming together, these important football leaders, and they're having several meetings, particularly a couple on the same day, of what are we going to do? What is the place of sport in wartime? What's acceptable? What do we find acceptable? And what do we think the public will find acceptable? Because that's the thing they've been battling since August 1914 is, you know, are we going to get criticised? Is it appropriate? Will the game lose its status in society? And so the FA decide that what's very interesting is the Football League clubs are meeting on the same day as the FA, but they're meeting in London in separate places. And the Football League start their meeting, and they get to the point where like, now we're happy. We think we've had a provisional vote. Professionalism will have a modified version of professionalism where wages are reduced, but we still play players. And they have an initial sort of quasi vote on it, and then they get the message from the FA who've been having their own separate meeting, and the FA have finally decided that, right, this is the shape. Football will continue. It should be like, it needs to be regional, and there's different things they put in to make it acceptable, which includes, and this is the big one, that there'll be no payment of players. So it's not payment of like payments to directors or payments to ground staff or anyone else connected with a football club. It's specifically the players, because again, as Alex has pointed out, the imbalance of this relationship, and it's the players who get picked out, even though there's a maximum wage at the time. So they're earning, twice the average skilled working man, but not hugely, like big sums like the top music hall star artists, for example. And so the FA makes this decision in England. In Scotland, they decide to have managed professionalism. So they reduce it to £1 or so a week that can be paid to players so they can meet some of the costs. The players aren't destitute, but they still will need to get wartime jobs. And so the FA says no professionalism, and the Football League clubs then go, right, cool, yeah, no, we're also thinking that we'll sort of like, we'll have another vote, and we approve and we support this. Because they could have said like, well, no, we disagree. We think there should be some modified payments for players. And so in these meetings, you see people agree, talk about it. And at the Football League meeting, it's very poignant, and you can see the wider impact of the war here, because some clubs refuse. So some clubs in the Midlands and the Northeast, they say that we won't play during wartime football. We don't think it's appropriate. It will distract men from going to the factories to doing munitions work, because there's awareness of where it's a total war. Civilians are as much as involved as men at the front. But you also have other people saying that it should continue. And one of those is Tom Malley. I'm not very bad at doing his name, but he's the secretary manager of Bradford Park Avenue. And he's actually had a son killed only, I think, about a few months earlier. His son's killed, his second eldest son is killed in about May, and this meetings are happening in June, July. And so he talks about the importance of sport to people, to those who can't fight, who are too old, too young, who are supporting families. And so you get this real sense that on this particular moment of like, this is the critical points, because they could have decided like, no, we're going to shut down completely. And so they make that decision to continue. But they also have to review it every summer after that. So there are these continuing discussions about what's appropriate, do we change or not, in terms of our approach. And some clubs come back in once conscription comes in. Several clubs come back, Blackburn Rovers, Birmingham City, for example, because they feel it's more compatible now that the stigma of volunteering and of having to rely on volunteers is gone. Now that everyone is forced to fight, whether they like to or not, so to speak, it makes it fairer and more equal. And I think, again, talking to what Alex said about the big criticism that football faced at the start of the war, is that very early on, people within the football world are some of the earliest people to call for conscription, because they see it as the best way to solve these debates and discussions about who joins up, who doesn't, what advantages some people have and don't have. And so by the introduction by 1916, the rest of society is almost caught up with those people within football are saying, well, actually, the easiest way to do this is just to conscript people. We can't rely on someone to want to do it. If it's going to be a national war effort like this, then we need to decide, and the state has to decide who should serve and who shouldn't serve. So it's quite fascinating on that particular part of it, whether football would continue or not continue.
That is fascinating. Alex, you have any further thoughts on that?
No, I think Alexander's covered that really well, but it was this constant pulling apart of football during those early years of the conflict, in terms of how and when should footballers either continue to play or actually sign up and fight. And it was the players themselves that were piggy in the middle here, and they bore the brunt of criticism a lot of the time. But if you look at the role they played, not only did they sign up and join the Footballers Battalion and so on, and not only did they join up as groups in PALS battalions and so on, but there were big recruiting campaigns at football stadiums, at football grounds, sometimes before football matches, or even at halftime, or at any point. So football grounds were used as recruitment grounds as well. And again, but footballers were being asked to ask the male supporters who were attending these events to actually join up. So footballers will, you know, on the one hand they were castigated, but on the other hand they were being used as recruitment officers in effect. And so I think this is what Alexander does really well. He really does show the predicament that footballers were placed in through no fault of their own. There were pawns in the bigger political discourse that was happening over recruitment and how whether it should be volunteering or statutory conscription. And I felt footballers were treated unfairly, and that clearly comes across in Alexander's book.
Amazing. I do know that some of my audience are, you know, just regular. I will use this word because they're from America, soccer fans. And most of them United fans, Chelsea fans, Arsenal fans. Alexander, how these teams have survived in the wartime? How these big clubs that of today's time did they start playing regionalized games? Can you share a little bit about what happened with these important clubs nowadays?
Yeah, definitely. So, and they're quite interesting ones because they illustrate some quite key aspects of that sort of experience for some of the very big clubs. I think start with Manchester United, sort of historically the most successful out of the ones you've mentioned there, to a degree. Or so I was born in the 80s, so I'm a Newcastle United fan. So grew up in the era of Manchester United dominance of the 90s, 2000s. So no offense, Chelsea or Arsenal fans. So Manchester United are an interesting one because and this is the other thing again, these clubs are relatively new, and in Chelsea's case they are very new because they are only founded in 1904-5, so they're all just like less than a decade old. Manchester United older, they sort of one of those clubs going back like quite a number of clubs to roots in working class sort of grassroots clubs that came out of British industry. So obviously they're famously Newton Heath Railways side. And so they've gone through that early period of breaking through, becoming a very successful team in the Edwardian period, but on the eve of war, sort of struggling a bit, sort of midish table, shall we say. And so they're a great example. It's very fascinating. It's could almost arguably be said to be one of the sort of the origins of the club's sort of focus on youth, which they are obviously quite famous for at different times. And so their approach during the wartime years is, once they've gone to regional football, is to focus on younger players. They're also, I should also hasten to add, involved in one of the big crisis moments of the 14-15 season and wartime football as a whole, which is the famous Good Friday match fixing scandal, in which a number of players from Manchester United and Liverpool came together to fix a game that would help benefit Manchester United in their relegation fight. And so this came out late. This happened in 1915. It then got investigated because the fix was a bit too obvious. People were able to tell that the match wasn't great. And that scandal, when it came out with some very big bans for the players involved, also helped damaged the football's reputation during the war. Again, kind of chiming in with the criticism that come from it, from its critics of like, this is a game that isn't very wholesome. It's involved gambling a lot. Gambling's bad because it can lead to these kind of things. This is what sport is about. This is the risk of professionalism. Although arguably the risk came because like the crowds were dropping, the players knew that they were potentially not going to get paid very much more, payment would disappear. So they're kind of looking out for their own self-interest, which again, one can take one's own view on that or not, but that they were acting in a relatively sensible manner in some ways on their finances. Also in connection with a club that hadn't potentially really treated them too well in the pre-war era at different times. It was quite hostile to some of its players they owned. So when it came to the wartime period, you couldn't play players. You had to get them from all over the country, wherever you could. So sometimes you got big name players who moved back to a hometown that you could come and have playing for you as guest players. So on the first day of the season, Manchester United arranged for Jesse Pennington, who's the England captain at fullback, to come up from West Bromwich Albion because that club isn't playing, and come to play for them. And that gets a bit of criticism because they were like, well, we thought players weren't meant to be travelling too far, but Manchester United have arranged for this player to come up from all the way down the West Midlands. That's quite a long trip to be going to play for, how's that, connecting to his war work. And so funnily enough, Jesse Pennington doesn't play again after that. If I think I've got that right, I have to go and double check. I think that's it right in my head. But so they focus a lot on young players in trying to get them through from like identifying around the local areas and encouraging young players to have a go. But that means that the team isn't massively successful. So it's very interesting. Youth policies don't always pay off, either short, medium, or long term. So they sort of have a relatively indifferent sort of wartime era. Chelsea, on the other hand, sort of they suffer in the sense that they had some of the biggest crowds pre the First World War. They have one of the biggest stadiums in Britain. In England rather, and they attract very big crowds, up to 60, 70,000 for some games against big teams in the First Division. But they suffer from statistically one of the largest decreases as lots of the fans go, and also because they attracted a very sort of a lot of the people who come into them weren't necessarily diehard Chelsea fans. They were coming because they were coming to see the best entertainment, and because of where the club was located, you could get people travelling from across London quite easily. And interesting enough, I came across a lovely quote where it was also quite a mixed crowd, a lot of like blokes bringing their girlfriends or female friends who were interested in football. So when those men joined up, those women sometimes didn't have the men to take them to the games as well. But Chelsea do quite well because they managed to hold on to some of their players, but also because they're in London, they're well placed for players from the north who are joining the army and then being either stationed in the south or travelling through London to go on to the Western Front. They can play for them whether they're stationed there or on leave. So a great example is the very young, talented centre forward, Charles Buchan. And he's originally a Londoner. He's gone to Sunderland, very successful there, helps win the league with them in the pre-war era, and then he gets stationed down there, and so he's in the Grenadier Guards, and so he gets leave to go and play for Chelsea at the weekends. So he's scoring lots of goals for them, and obviously he's got a very understanding military personnel who are happy for him to like go out and play at the weekends. But they also get other players in at different times. So that's it. That's a good example. And then Arsenal is the other club you mentioned. Are sort of doing middle table of the First Division pre the start of the war. And they're an interesting one because one of the most notable things that happens to them during the war is that they end up sharing their ground with Tottenham Hotspur for a period, because Tottenham lose their ground. It's taken away because part of the ground is taken up with having a gas mask factory. And then the ground is, because there's some issues about access in time, the government requisitions the entire ground for use. So Tottenham can't play there. I think I've got this right. It's a struggle sometimes to remember all of the clubs and all what's happening to all of them. But in essence, if I've got that right, Tottenham lose their ground and then they have to share. They jointly share with Arsenal and then also Clapton Orient. So they spend a bit of time, fans presumably like going between the two different ones for home games. So that's like a very interesting story around that one. And I suppose
That's really, really interesting. I think Arsenal fans will, particularly those that doesn't know much about the history of the club, will be amazed by learning that. I don't know, Alex, you have any thoughts that you want to add to those like interesting facts?
No, it's I'm just happy to carry on with the conversation. I think Alexander's covered that really well from those three clubs' perspective. The one thing I would add is that players from those teams were actually not only were they fighting on the front lines, but some of them were being quite heroic. An ex-player from Arsenal, Tim Coleman, not only did he win a military medal for bravery, but he also helped, because a lot of football was played behind the lines, and he was also helped his unit team actually win the Flanders Cup as well. So they were having an influence not only at home, but also on the front line as well. And that, when people hear back home that Tim Coleman has won a medal for bravery and he's still winning medals for cup competitions paid behind the lines, that also has a positive impact on the home front as well.
Yeah, indeed. So coming up to maybe my last question here is how, Alexander, how the entertainment industry have influenced football in the war times, and what was the role of women's football also during this period?
In terms of the women's football, it's the First World War is a major sort of watershed moment, really. You've had women playing football since men have started playing football in the 19th century, and also women played sometimes in the folk football of the earlier times as well. What you have in the Victorian period are sometimes quite short-lived attempts by women to be allowed to play football. I think this is the key thing, is that they play football, but they face some at times quite direct hostility, whether it be physical. So one of the first games in the 1880s, like a formalized one, is stopped by like crowd pitch invasions. In the 1890s, the British Ladies Football Club tours around the UK, playing a lot of games, essentially between sort of two sides within the club as a whole. But facing a fair amount of hostility, and that's a very much sort of an entertainment almost sort of touring model. But attempts to sort of establish grassroots women's football are slow and uneven and face a lot of direct sort of obstacles and hostility. What you see in the First World War is essentially, well, we can argue, like the first big growth of grassroots association football women's teams, often connected to those industries that Alex talked about earlier, where women are going into the heavy industries, the wartime munitions, where in some cases women are making up to 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% of the workforce in particular sites, especially new factories. And so it is this watershed moment where there's still obstacles, there's still sexism, there's still attempts to discourage them, but at the same time they are playing, they're given more access to it, they are forming teams. You have the earliest cup and leagues being formed as well, and you get up to over several hundred teams, probably thousands of players taking part. And obviously, and Alex has also said, raising large amounts of money for wartime charities. But also you can see that women are getting to enjoy playing football for themselves. They know what they get out of it. They get the same things that men get out of it, in the sense of, in the particular areas of, like, you get part of your team, camaraderie, the joy of playing the game, traveling to games, especially if you're in a successful team, playing in front of very large crowds, because obviously that's really amazing when you get that opportunity. You get the growth of some of the early international games as well, with sides going from the north of Ireland, of the island of Ireland, from around Belfast to Tyneside and vice versa, and teams travelling from Northern England to Scotland. So we get the origins of women's international football going as well. And then, but obviously what's very sad within that is that in the post-war period, you have a drop-off as women leave those wartime industries, are demobilized, and that starts during the war. But then you start to get, across 1920 and 21, a resurgence of women coming back into playing, or newer, younger players starting to play. And then obviously you have famously the FA's ban of prohibiting its clubs to host games between women in 1921, which then lasts in England up to the late 1960s, which very much doesn't stop women's football, but puts a huge block on its progress and development. Because in that period between 1917 and 21, we're seeing very big crowds. I think sometimes it's presented as men were threatened by women's football coming in, replacing men's football, and it was going to become too popular. And with that one, I disagree. Just in terms of when you look at the actual statistics, it's actually a boom period for both men and women's football, because there is this big explosion of interest in sport, obviously people have been away, they want to enjoy themselves, and that applies to things like cinema as well. And in the 20s, early 20s, actually, women's and men's football crowds are both rising. There's this big, broader interest in it, and the two could coincide, because as we can see today, the two can coincide. One doesn't have to rise without the other one falling necessarily. And so that is the great big sort of loss of the wartime, like one of the positive wartime changes of that, from that wartime period to the post-war. I think what it you get in the men's game, it just shows you get basically just a continued interest in men's football that had been starting pre-First World War. The Edwardian period particularly is a period of very big of growth and boom, and that's the same in the interwar period, with some obvious wider points of trend. So it booms shortly after the war, drops off a little bit, rises, then you have the Depression. But even within the Depression era, some parts, especially around the south, where the economy is more resilient or less affected, crowds continue to rise, like in the south of England. So there's the war does not disrupt men's professional football broadly too much. It affects certain clubs in certain trajectories, and obviously because some clubs stop playing, one or two smaller professional clubs lose their grounds, they struggle to get them back. Where the impact obviously probably is the most is obviously those individual lives of players who lose 4 or 5 years of their careers to the war, or lose their lives, whether their careers through being killed or being maimed. And so that human cost is, I tried to pick out some individual stories, but obviously one can never really it's a struggle to quantify those thousands and thousands of different individual experiences and what the war may have done to the trajectory of their lives or not. But
yeah, that's again really interesting, how history has been told, and what is the actual version of the past, right? Alex, I don't know if you want to complement Alexander's thoughts on women's football during the wartime, because I know you are also involved with women's football to a degree.
Yeah,
Nowadays.
indeed. Well, I agree with Alexander's analysis, but what it showed that period was that not only could women play football, but they could also do men's jobs as well. And it was a perfect storm at the time, because you also had the suffragettes movement, and they're looking for political equality and trying to develop more social equality for women as well. And football, I felt at the time, was a medium that showed women in a different light, from many different perspectives, to their benefit at the time. But it was all undone to a large degree in terms of the ban. When the Football Association said that football was unsuitable for females. And if you talk about short-sightedness, that was definitely a great example of that. And again, it's another example of where the football authorities of the time didn't have their finger on the pulse, because as Alexander highlighted, women's football was not a threat to men's football, because people at the time would maybe, if there was a women's match during the week and a men's match at the weekend, they'd go and watch both. They wouldn't choose between both. And it wasn't a competition as such at all. You could have the same audiences at both matches if they were played in the same vicinity. And it was massive blunder by the Football Association at the time. That's not looking with hindsight. It was at the time, because the manner in which women's football had grown and how attractive it was to the football-going public.
Yeah, and if I might just add to that as well, is that I think the thing that I find quite most poignant about that is that many of these games, women's games in the post-war period, were being played for post-war charities. So during the war, they played for wartime charities, and in the post-war period, they're playing for both civilian ones like local hospitals, but often quite a number of them are specifically for causes connected to the war, whether it be war memorials, whether it be funds for towns in France for their rebuilding, whether it be for raising money for the dependents of those killed during the war. And so what I find particularly challenging within that is that because there's another discussion, because part of the reason the FA raised was around their concerns about how the money was being used, how the money was being accounted for in the charity matches that were being held. And there's some legitimacy in that, because there's more actually questions to do with like who are the male promoters of these games, how are the finances of charity games being looked after. And so this isn't to do with the players per se, or the female players. This is about, and this is linking into a long-standing and, to be perfectly honest, like acceptable concerns that you can have about how is a charity being conducted, how is the money being accounted for? Because they had lots of scandals during the war of people using the war to create fake charities, to steal money from charities. So it's part of that longer, concerns about this. And there are some, and also there's some issues with sometimes the crowds where I think getting, in some cases, the newspapers, the crowd figures are bigger than what they were turning up, which always happens with some crowd newspapers in this period. Then there's a certain amount of boosterism by some people who want to improve that image of like how popular the games are. But then when you have a discrepancy of 10,000 people, that raise issues of like, how much money is or isn't being accounted for. But by taking away that ability for men's clubs to support these games with their stadia, which is, again, as we see today, the infrastructure is there for women's football to be popular because it's the stadia that men's clubs, or clubs rather, have. So if they're given over to women, they can have these huge crowds that could potentially attracted tens of thousands of people to raise hundreds of pounds, which in today's terms, as Alex was saying, is like the equivalent of millions of pounds. And these could have gone towards supporting those like disabled servicemen, the dependents, like the widows of those whose husbands have been killed in the war, and a whole range of other, really worthy causes. And in effect, they made it more difficult to raise that kind of money, which when you look at the men's football and how their financial support for these wartime charities dropped off within a few years of the war afterwards. Yeah, again, I find more challenging because potentially more money could have been brought in a way that men's clubs weren't necessarily doing themselves. So in that context of the post-war, it's again one of these, it's a missed opportunity, not just for women's football, but for that broader support of those who had given an awful lot in various different ways. And that is, again, it's part of that, is Britain a home fit for heroes, in that kind of political phrase of that period. It's quite fascinating to imagine these counterfactuals sometimes of what might have happened if there'd been more support for women's football.
Indeed, I will add a final question here. I'm sorry, I promised my last question. But do you know anything about, even in the National Football Museum where you work, are there any work for memorialization of those women's footballers that helped during war times, keeping up with the morale, helping the economy, but also after the post-war period that you just mentioned, they helped with soldiers, disabled soldiers, etc. Because normally we tend only to pay homage to the fallen soldiers, right? It's the men that have died. But and that was part of one of our conversations with Alex in previous episodes. We tend to forget the important role of women to make possible the victory of the men in the battlefield. So how women's football has been dealing with paying homage to these women nowadays?
So in the football museum, we've got we try to tell the story of women's football or women in football throughout. We've got specific sections where we have actually covered the wartime period. So women's football is included there with like images of some of the teams from that period. We cover both the First and Second World War together in that particular part. And then we also have a particular section around Lily Parr. We have a statue that the FA had commissioned number of years ago. And she was one of the leading players of the Ditker ladies in the interwar period. She started playing towards the end of the war, I'm trying to think. She wasn't playing necessarily in quite some of the wartime years. And so we kind of tell that story of the ban era of like Ditker's coming through, the ban coming in, but then them continuing and other women's teams continuing as well. So we try to sort of make it clear, again, that's one of those kind of hidden histories that, again, sometimes people assume because of the ban, the way it's phrased and assumed, it's like women's football was stopped completely, and it's not. It's quite, in some ways, quite specific. FA affiliated clubs can't host games. If you're non-FA affiliated and have a pitch, then you can let them play on it, because they often played on grounds owned by like rugby league clubs, for example. It's outside of the FA's provision. So we kind of cover it in that ways. But we also have some of that broader memorialization as well, because we also have on display the plaque, the FA Football Association's War Memorial plaque that used to be in their offices until they moved sites in the sort of across the 90s and 2000s. And so that's quite interesting, because that's the war memorial that was done. I think it took them a couple of years actually to put that all together, because again, we sort of sometimes think these things came up straight away, and actually it's a process of 2, 3, 4, 5 years sometimes, or even longer, to fund a memorial, decide what it will be, where it will be, what kind, whether it's going to be one that people can use. So there's, in the UK, there's like, parks, other facilities that still exist today. One of the little things I found was there's still one sort of smallish amateur or semi-pro club who still play at the War Memorial Ground, because it was built in the early 20s, and that was their living memorial to those members of their club who had died. But the plaque we have is obviously a more traditional commemorative style, and it's interesting because it's got some very of its time patriotic messages. But what we've seen probably in the last like 20 odd years, and especially sort of around the centenary and onwards, is quite a number of clubs, major professional clubs in the UK, have developed and put out new plaques, as the historians have been doing research to put plaques out there to memorialize the players who were killed both in the First and the Second World Wars, or sometimes to get older ones out and give them a bit more love and care. Because one of the sad things is actually quite a number of clubs have lost their memorials. They were disposed of. One of the most sort of sad ones I remember reading about, Crystal Palace during the First World War created an amazing sort of wooden roll of honor. So it wasn't just men who were killed, it was also men who served, and created this roll of honor with photographs inset into it, all the details and updated as they went along. And then at some point over the time, a lot of the Crystal Palace archive was destroyed, thrown away. So that our particular memorial no longer exists. At Newcastle United, my own particular club, they've actually, the club historian has been very lovely in sharing information with me, Paul Joanna, that is, and charting that story, because at one point it was firmly on display where people could see. Then as those memories faded over time, it got put away. At one point it was in the storage cupboard, and now it's out alongside a new plaque to accompany it as well at the ground. So it's very interesting how that history and that interest in that history has mapped some of these broader changes in British society, of the memory of the war being remembered in a certain way, then being lost, and now and a sort of new level of re-engagement with it around the centenary. But hopefully, I'd like to think that hopefully those war memorials won't get put away again. They will remain in prominent places and will be seen, that allow to people to continue engaging with these obviously very important parts of our shared and collective history.
Yeah.
I'd like to pick up on Alexander's point about how that aspect of history is being protected. I've got a really good example, Leyton Orient. If you go into their supporters club, which is part of the stadium, they have memorialized most of their walls with the club's commitment to the First World War, in terms of players who went off to fight, those who sacrificed their lives. And if colleagues, if they're ever visiting London, I would always advise them to go to Leyton Orient's ground, not only to watch a match, but also to go into their supporters club, because Malcolm McCarthy and his colleagues who look after the club's memorial organization. They do a significant amount of work there, and I've seen since setting up the Football and War Network, when I visit the clubs, Exeter City is another example where they have memorialized the sacrifices made by their players and other personnel. And you see it much more in clubs outside of the Premier League at times. Smaller football clubs will have significant memorials to their players, and it's growing, and it has grown over the last 3 or so decades. I've seen a sea change in how players and clubs have memorialized the First and Second World Wars in particular.
That's really encouraging, and happy to hear that. So we're gonna wrap up things here. This has been incredible experience for all viewers, learning a lot of new things. So Alexander, where the viewers can buy your book, and how they can talk with you if they have other questions. So please share.
Yes, so the book is available from my publisher's Pen and Sword. So it's available often direct from the website, and I think there's often a discount on it at different times, or other major sort of like UK book chains like Waterstones, for example. And I'm in terms of where to find me and my work, I'm on Twitter. I think is it at Dr. Alex Jack1. Or if you just do a search for Alex Jacskon National Football Museum, you should be able to find me. And some of my other publishing and writing around sort of football history, you can find it also at Playing Pasts, which is the online website magazine for the British Society of Sports History. And I've got some other articles on there to do with women's football in the early sort of 1920s that kind of link into the kind of discussions we've been having today, and there's some of the work I've done since the book as well. I'm just trying to think. I think and just also obviously, like, if anyone ever gets the chance to come to the UK, obviously recommend that you come and have a look at the football museum, because we've got some amazing displays, some material too late with the wartime years, but also just a lot to do with the history of football in England.
Oh yeah, I highly echo that, because it's a fascinating museum. I love that place. Alex, tell viewers where they can learn more about the Football War Network collaborations, and about your job too, about your work.
Okay. You can find us on Twitter at Football and War. We're very active there. We tweet and repost every day. We have the Football and War website, which is on the University of Wolverhampton's platform, and we have a ever-expanding blog article series where Alexander and other colleagues have all written blog articles on different aspects of football and war. We've just recently published the other day another article in relation to Athletic Bilbao by our colleague Christopher Evans. So that's a really interesting article. And we also run a series of seminars in the UK. And we have gone into partnership with the National Army Museum and the Army Football Association and the Western Front Association. And we've got a series of 3 events. And the second of those events, on the 11th of July at the National Army Museum in Chelsea in London, will feature Alexander, along with Clive Jackson and Carrie Dunn as well. And they'll be talking about different aspects of football and the First World War. Alexander will talk about football on the home front. whilst Clive will talk about football behind the lines, and Carrie Dunn will talk about aspects of women's football. So watch out for announcements by the National Army Museum closer to the time, but keep the date in your diary, the 11th of July, and Alexandra will be part of that panel event there as well.
That's amazing. I wish I could be there, but folks that are watching us, if you are around in London, the UK, please go. I will make sure that when the more details comes out, I will also share in my Football Studies Twitter channel. So with that said, I again thanks very much, Alexander and Alex, for being with me, for being part of this 9th episode of Football Studies, and I will see you in the next time. Thank you very much.